So, with the idea of Thanksgiving, in the holiday we're about to honor, and I think of the two words, thanks and giving, that are put together to name this holiday, which could be reversed into giving thanks. And I always think of something in between that joins the two, because some sort of journey of the soul or experience that if you're thankful for something, you want to give back, or if you've been given something, you also want to be thankful. And so with that in mind, I was thinking of a theme today that would be a yellow brick road of the soul. And as much as I had great fun thinking which of you would be which of these characters, with Albert being a shoe-in for George, someone with a little more sense than I had talked some sense into me and wanted me to honor their sacrifice.
All right.
So we instead are going to have this little guy, and it was a rebel in his own time. And so when we talk about the Pilgrim story, and they weren't even known as pilgrims, until much later. They were really more known as separatists who had their own spiritual beliefs that were different, and they had to leave where they were from and move elsewhere, and they were still feeling that they weren't having the freedom and identity that they wanted. So they, like many people who are still seeking to find their place, decided to seek the voyage to the New World. And as many of us who have tried to take a trip or make a move or do something that's going to make a big change in our life, things don't always go as planned. And the two ships that they had commissioned to take them across were not seaworthy when they got in them, and they had to turn around and go back to port and try to get these ships to be more seaworthy. And in their effort to do that, the one ship that they had tried to commission just was not going to be able to make the trip. They were able to get the Mayflower in enough condition that they thought they could make it, but they had to leave part of their crew behind. And so as they started with this journey across with their store of food and their provisions to try to start a new life in this new world, the journey, because of problems with this leaky ship that was very rough condition, ended up making them have to do repairs in the middle of their voyage, and it took them twice as long to get across than they planned. Once they arrived in the New World, they were not where they thought they would be. They were farther north, and it wasn't the time of year they thought they would be there. They got there in December instead of in November. And they weren't initially greeted in a very friendly manner from the natives that were there, who had experienced their type before. So here, they've gone with their voyage, they made it with their ship, and we'll put up here where turkey fell. But they quickly ran into, on their second trip into town, onto the land, they met a native who did speak some English, who followed up with another native who spoke perfect English. He'd met their kind before too. He'd been captured and sold into slavery and sent to Europe. But he came back, and he would be maybe one of the least likely people you would expect that would be of help to them. But he was able to translate and introduce them to the neighboring tribe, who was able to create an alliance with them and some unity. They were then able to teach them to fish and how to grow crops, and let them settle in a village that had been wiped out by a plague that the guy that had been kidnapped and sold into slavery once belonged to. I don't know if that was wishful thinking, that something would happen to them, but no. But they survived, and they settled there, and they were taught how to cultivate crops and fish, and they finally were able to move forward and survive, even though at least half of them perished on the journey over, and soon after. The rest of them did survive, and it was very much because of the natives that were there to help them. And so with this experience that they had with the native population there, they couldn't have been more different, but they were able to broker a peace deal that said that if there was a crime committed by one of the settlers, the new immigrants, that they would be tried in an Indian court, and vice versa. And this allowed them to have peace for almost half a century and work together to protect each other. And you couldn't have found two groups more different than each other in how they dressed, how they housed themselves, what they ate, their spiritual beliefs, how they governed themselves, but they were able to come together. I think in part it had potentially to do with a lot of the loss that they experienced and how vulnerable they were. Because they weren't later on in life known to be the most accepting of people who didn't believe exactly like them. But at this time they were, and they got to know the souls of these people who were different than them. And therefore, not only when you consider the life expectancy back then was only around 40, before they left Europe, not to mention half of them perished, that was, they were adults when they arrived, it was a lifetime of peace and much of the next lifetime of the next generation. I think it was that knowing of these people that you couldn't, in an abstract way, decide, demonize, or feel as vilify as being different than you, because you really helped each other. And that knowing of each other is what led to what we now know as the Thanksgiving feast. And where they were able to share their resources and share this meal together, which, as our new nation and this new world moved on, that became a story that was near and dear to the hearts of the population here. So much so that when we once again had turmoil in our country and George Washington was trying to unify the country again, he relied on the story of Thanksgiving and celebrated it that year after the Revolution to try to unify the population again. Then the next juncture that the holiday that we now know was celebrated was once again with Lincoln after the Civil War, trying to unify the country again and have unity. He made it a national holiday, and we've celebrated it ever since then. So when we think of how people can be brought together in that way, I think of another story that we have in the Bible of people coming together to share a meal and have a feast and have leftovers, which would be the story of the loaves and fishes. And with that story, why do we need to stand on this? With the story of the loaves and fishes, one of the interpretations of it that I've always been fond of is more of a modern scientific interpretation, but that is where Christ had all these people following him, and they were so inspired by his good works and his ability to heal the mind and the sick and so forth. And these people who had followed him, there came this juncture where they were concerned about how they were going to feed everyone. And most of the people who had followed him initially had planned to go seek him out or follow him and bring their elderly or bring their sick. And much like the people on the Mayflower took twice as long to get there as they planned, they had enough food to get them through that voyage. They even had some store of food when they reached land, even though it took twice as long. And Christ's disciples were concerned about the scarcity of resources to feed these people and what it would cost them to feed them all. And their crowd had swelled. There were a lot of people who spontaneously followed them as well. And yet Christ was able to take what was given to him and break the bread and share his wine and share the fish with the multitudes that were there. And it was so inspiring to the people who were there, who had already been inspired by him, many had already been healed by him, that they were able to pull loaves of bread out of their robes, and they were able to open their satchels and pull casks of wine and fish and feed the multitudes that were there. And the reason I like that interpretation of the story is that it just shows how something we can all do, and we do all of the time, where if we share our resources, then what we can do to, because in that story, as either interpretation comes to the conclusion, there's plenty left over, and there was enough to feed everyone. Whether it's the biblical story that we see, or if it's a modern interpretation, there was by sharing there was plenty left over, and it was a story to inspire. And I think when we look at our own church traditions in the Christian tradition, and also throughout a lot of other spiritual faiths, there's the concept of tithing. And when we talk about tithing, I know when I was really young, it was introduced to me, the topic, besides just something we do as a ritual in church, and I was told by a minister at the time that that you should tithe 10% of not only your resources and your financial wealth, but to 10% of your time. And that when you tithe, it doesn't need to be to your church. It could be wherever you get your spiritual growth. And with the idea of tithing our time, sometimes just when we share personal experience, or we, help somebody or do something, it has a real value. And in my own experience, somebody tithing their time would have been one of my first ministers that I chose on my own as an adult. And that's when I first started college in Portland. I had found a church that was a New Thought church like Unity. It was called Living Enrichment Center. And there was a very charismatic minister there named Mary Morrissey. And she had grown over the years to 3,000 people coming every Sunday. And the building only held 1,000 at a time, so they had to do 3 services. And I think it was maybe my second or third service that I went to that the topic of it was learning love. And I'm sitting there, and she starts talking about an experience that she had growing up when she had married her high school sweetheart that she grew up with. And there was another couple that had a similar story. They'd grown up with, and they had married, and they were their best friends. And they started to notice that there was some problems in their marriage. And they weren't sure what was going on because they were such wonderful people they couldn't imagine that there'd be anything they couldn't work out. And so they called and talked to her and her husband did. And the wife had said, confirmed that they were having issues and they were going to get a divorce. And for Mary and her husband, they just couldn't imagine why these two would ever divorce, and they thought there must be something they could do to help. And the wife said, no, there's nothing you can do to help. Unfortunately, we are going to have to divorce because my husband's come out to me as being gay. And for Mary, she said in that moment, what went through her head, she grew up in the 50s and 60s, and so in the social world then, it was not acceptable to be gay. And then, the faith that you grew up in that time period, it also wasn't. But she said in that moment, everything going through her head, this wasn't some abstract person, just like the Native Americans weren't in that story. This was somebody they knew. They grew up with this guy. They knew he was a wonderful, wonderful person. And you couldn't vilify him by, things that a dogma that you've grown up with. And she immediately at that moment expanded her concept of love and her ability to love. And embrace new thinking and somebody in her life in a greater way. And for me, sitting there at 18 years old, having just tried to come out myself, to myself and accept myself, let alone anybody else at that point, having somebody accept me in that way and honor me was so wonderful. And I think when we go back to our Thanksgiving story and how they accepted each other and had to get to know each other by the situation they were in, because when you look at the story, the natives that were in the neighboring tribe had problems with other tribes that were in conflict with them, and their alliance together allowed them to accept each other, protect each other, teach each other, and grow together. And I know for myself in that moment when I was there and I heard that talk, it really empowered my entire life, and it completely changed everything for me, so much so that from that day forward, if I ever met somebody who was damaged by religion and felt rejected for whatever reasons, especially gay people I met, I would take them to a Unity church wherever I was, no matter where I was in my spiritual path, where I was going to. It was like my emergency doctor, place that I would go. Because, the thing about a Unity church and the one I was in there, and I'm sure many of you have been to other Unity churches, there's a common thread of diverse population of loving people that anybody would want as their neighbors or their friend. And the format in the Unity Church very much resembles a lot of traditional Christian churches, yet people are very loving and accepting, and you can just feel it when you walk in the door. It's something that, the people I take to a Unity Church are immediately healed. It's amazing. Like one service, sometimes it takes 2, but it's like they go on in their life, they may never go to a Unity Church again, but that loving acceptance that they get there, and it's not like anything was even necessarily discussed about who they were, their identity, or their past harms. And it's one of those things I always would try to quantify and explain to people why being in this environment and being accepted, or feeling accepted, or feeling the energy helps heal people. And there are ways I can describe it like I just did, but it also reminds me of another story that helps explain maybe what is unspoken. And that I think I mentioned to many of you at different times the story before, but there was this psychologist named Bob Rosenthal who had this theory about energy and thoughts. And so he decided, because he had a clinical research study that he was conducting, and he decided to play a little joke on his research students. and see if this really works. So he went one night before and he took their lab rats and he put on their cages, incredibly smart, incredibly dumb, incredibly smart, incredibly dumb, throughout all of these cages. And the next morning he had, when students came in, he had them run them through tests. And when they came through all the tests, they found that the ones that they had labeled as incredibly smart test twice as well as the ones, and were twice as smart as the ones that were labeled incredibly dumb. And it was, fascinating. So they went back to the tapes to see what had happened. And as I've told this story in the past, I missed part of it. And when I went and reread it for this talk, they did notice that they handled them differently. They put them through the same test, but they were more gentle and loving to the ones they perceived as being incredibly smart. But there was another factor too, is what they were thinking and their perception of them. And between those two factors, these rats performed completely different. The ones that were labeled incredibly dumb acted incredibly dumb. So, I look at that story and I think about how our power of thought, which we all are, now, he said when he first finished the study, no one would believe him, and he had a hard time even publishing it because it looked so ridiculous. But now, as time has moved forward, we have actually scientifically measured thought and energy. And people are now getting, even in the medical world, more accepting of the power of thought and the power of energy. So, as you voyage forth this weekend, on your journeys of the soul, to gather with your families and your friends and celebrate Thanksgiving dinner, as many people have in the past, whether it be the story of the loaves of fishes, or the story of the pilgrims, or the story of the rats. Just remembering how you handle people you love, and how you perceive them, and how you think of them, and your expectations of them really do, on a physical and a mental level, influence them and our experiences with them. And so I hope everybody's able to go forth this weekend and have a wonderful Thanksgiving and a great week that produces something positive.